The phone rang at 6:40 in the morning. I was already at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and the paper folded to the obituaries, the way I'd been doing since my wife passed 4 years back. The number on the screen was my daughter-in-law's. She never called me at 6:40 in the morning. She never called me at all, truth be told. Anything she needed from me, my son delivered like a courier. I let it ring twice more before I picked up. "The rent is overdue," she said. No hello. No good morning. Just that, flat and sharp like she was reading off a bill collector's script. "Did you transfer it yet?" I set the coffee cup down slow. I felt something cold and clean spread across the inside of my chest. The way a frozen lake feels when you finally step out onto it after waiting all winter. I smiled. First time in maybe a month I'd smiled like that. "Didn't I tell you?" I said. She paused. I let her pause. I let that pause stretch out into the hallway and out the front door and all the way down the street. "Tell me what?" "You'll see," I said, and I hung up. I'm 63 years old. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I came up from nothing. My father drove a delivery truck for a bakery in Pittsburgh, and my mother took in laundry and ironing for the doctors and lawyers on the Hill. I worked from the time I was 12 years old. I painted houses. I hauled scrap. I went into the trades at 17, learned electrical, learned plumbing, learned every honest thing a pair of hands can do. And by the time I was 30, I owned my first duplex. By the time I was 50, I owned 11 buildings outright. 2 strip centers, 4 apartment buildings, 2 duplexes, a warehouse I leased to a furniture importer, and the building on Galway Avenue where my son and his new wife happened to live. The penthouse, top floor, view of the river on one side and the old steel bridge on the other. I never told my son how much I was worth. Not because I was hiding it. Exactly. Because his mother and I made a decision when he was small that we'd raise him to believe we were comfortable but ordinary, and that he'd have to make his own way. We failed at the second part. We did not fail at the first. My son turned 32 last August. To my knowledge, he has held 3 jobs in his entire adult life, the longest of them lasting 11 months. He has a business degree from a school I paid for. He has a wardrobe of suits I paid for. He has a car I paid for, and a watch I paid for, and a girlfriend turned fiancée turned wife I had also, it turns out, been paying for, though I didn't fully understand that until the morning of the phone call. His wife's name is Cameron. I'll call her my daughter-in-law from here on because every time I say the name, I feel something twist in my jaw. She is 28 and beautiful in the cold way. Certain women are beautiful, the way an iceberg is beautiful from a cruise ship deck. Her parents own a marina down in Annapolis. They're well off. Comfortable. Not rich the way my daughter-in-law wanted to be. Not rich the way she decided she was entitled to be when she married into what she thought was my modest little family. She'd met me twice before the wedding. The first time, she shook my hand at a dinner my son arranged at some restaurant where the menu didn't have prices. And she looked me up and down once, registered the flannel shirt and the work boots and the calloused hand, and gave me a smile that didn't include her eyes. The second time was at a Sunday brunch where she spent the entire meal on her phone and excused herself to take a call before the entree arrived. I'd told my son, gently after that second meeting, that I had concerns, that she seemed cold, that she didn't seem to listen to him when he spoke. He laughed at me. He said, "Dad, you don't get it. She's just used to a different lifestyle." That word, lifestyle, he used it about 30 more times that year. About 3 months before the phone call, my son came to me for $50,000 for a ring. I'm going to say that again because I still don't quite believe I lived through it. He came to me and asked for $50,000 for an engagement ring. I asked him if he'd lost his mind. He told me she'd seen the kind of ring she wanted in a magazine. He told me she had expectations. He told me her friends had all gotten rings in that range, and she'd be embarrassed if he showed up with anything less. He told me he was good for it. He'd pay me back. This was an investment in his future happiness. I wrote the check. God help me, I wrote the check. I told myself it was the last one. I told myself I was buying peace. I told myself a lot of things that morning that I now understand were lies I needed to hear from my own mouth. 2 weeks after the check cleared, I asked my son when the wedding would be. I wanted to know so I could clear my calendar, take the suit out of the closet, get a haircut, maybe pick up something nice for his bride from the jeweler downtown. He told me they hadn't set a date yet. He told me they were still figuring out the venue, the guest list, all that. I said, "Whatever you need, son, I'm here," he said. Thanks, Dad. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday, I drove over to the building on Galway Avenue to inspect the boiler. The supers was out of town, and the tenants in 4B had complained about hot water. I came up through the service entrance the way I always do, because I'm still the kind of man who'd rather use the back stairs than wait on an elevator. I checked the boiler. I tightened a fitting. I came up to the penthouse to say hello, because I was already in the building. The door was propped open with a doorstop. There was music playing inside. There was a woman I didn't recognize arranging white flowers on a long table. There was a man in a tuxedo shirt running an extension cord across the floor. The whole apartment smelled like roses and that sharp lemony cleaner the rental companies use after a party. My daughter-in-law walked out of the kitchen carrying 2 champagne flutes. She saw me and stopped. She did not smile, say hello. She looked at the doorstop, then at the florist, then at me, and she said, with the same flat tone she would later use about the rent, "Oh, you weren't supposed to be here today." I stood there in the doorway in my work jacket. I said, "What's going on?" She set the flutes down on the counter. She tilted her head, and she said, in the exact words I will carry to my grave, "We got married yesterday. Just a small thing. Just for the people who mattered." I asked her where my son was. She said he was at the spa. They had a brunch reception starting at noon. About 200 guests. She said it like the number was a small one. She said it the way you'd say $200 to a man worth $2 million. She said they hadn't told me because she didn't think I'd fit the aesthetic. She actually used that word, aesthetic. She said the photographer was very particular about how the family photos needed to look, and she'd talked it over with my son, and they'd decided it would be easier for everyone if I just saw the pictures afterward. She said my brother also hadn't been invited, for the same reason. My brother. The only family I have left in this world besides my son. My brother who flew in from Phoenix for every one of my son's birthdays for 32 years. My brother who carried that boy on his shoulders at the county fair when he was 4. My brother who couldn't be in the photos because of the aesthetic. I didn't say a word. I want you to understand that. I didn't shout. I didn't curse her. I didn't break a single one of those champagne flutes she'd just set down, although I will tell you the thought crossed my mind. I just nodded once. I turned around. I walked back down the service stairs and out to my truck, and I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel for I don't know how long. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been an hour, then I drove home, and I called my brother. My brother is 61. He runs a tile and stone yard down in Arizona. He's been my best friend my entire life. I told him what happened. I told him every word. He was quiet for a long time on the other end. Then he said, "Brother, you know what you have to do." I said, "I know." He said, "Don't do it angry. Do it slow. Do it right." I said, "I know." I called my lawyer the next morning. My lawyer is a woman about my age who has handled my real estate work for almost 20 years. She is a sharp, practical, no-nonsense person who once told a city councilman to his face that he was a crook. I trust her with my life. I sat in her office on a Wednesday and I laid the whole thing out and I said, Tell me what I can do legally, ethically, and quickly." She asked me one question. "Are you sure?" I said I was sure. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing. Here's what people don't understand about my son's living situation, which the comments on these kinds of stories always ask about. The penthouse on Galway Avenue was not a gift. It was never a gift. When my son and my daughter-in-law moved in 2 years before they were married, my son begged me to let them rent it. He told me he wanted them to have a real address, a real home, something to build from. He told me he'd pay rent like any other tenant, on time every month, and that I wasn't to give him any sweetheart deal because he wanted to earn it like a man. Of course he didn't earn it like a man. Of course he came back to me within 2 months and said his startup wasn't bringing in cash yet, and could I float the rent for a quarter. Of course 1 quarter turned into a year, and 1 year turned into 2, and the rent he was supposed to be paying me was, in fact, money I was transferring from one of my own accounts to another every single month, while my daughter-in-law went around telling her friends they lived in a luxury rental. He didn't own the apartment. He didn't co-own it. He didn't have his name on the deed or the lease or the mailbox. He had a key. That was the entire extent of his legal interest in the property. My lawyer confirmed it that Wednesday afternoon while I sat across the desk from her drinking lukewarm coffee out of a paper cup. She said, 3-day notice in this state. If the rent is overdue and there's no formal lease, You can post a 3-day pay-or-quit notice and follow up with eviction filing on the 4th day. They'll have 10 days after that to respond before a judgment hearing. I said, how fast can we file? She said, tomorrow, but sleep on it. I slept on it. I didn't sleep actually, but I lay there in the dark and I thought about 100 things. I thought about my son at 6 years old asking me to teach him to swing a hammer. I thought about him at 12 asking me what a mortgage was. I thought about him at 16 telling me he never wanted to work with his hands like I did. Because his hands were for thinking, not for breaking. I thought about how I'd laughed and ruffled his hair and told his mother that night, he's gonna be smarter than both of us. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said. She had been gentler than me. She would have wanted to try to talk it out, sit down with him, have a conversation. But she would also have been the first one to call me a fool for what I had been doing to that boy for 32 years, and by the time the sun came up over the backyard, I knew the answer. I called my lawyer at 7. I said, go. The 3-day notice was posted on the door of the penthouse that Thursday afternoon. My lawyer had a process server slide the formal copy under the door in a thick envelope, and then tape a second copy to the door at eye level. I'd given her a list of additional instructions. I'd told her to also stop the autopay on the building's utility account that I'd been quietly covering for them. I told her to revoke the parking permits for the 2 cars in the garage downstairs, both of which were registered to LLCs that I owned. I told her to call the building manager and have the locks on the apartment scheduled for change on day 4, the moment the notice period legally expired. My daughter-in-law called me at 6:40 in the morning the next Tuesday. That was the call I started this story with. After I hung up on her, I poured the rest of my coffee in the sink and I drove down to Galway Avenue. I parked across the street where I could see the front entrance. I sat in the truck with the radio off and I waited. My son came out of the building at 7:15. He was on his phone. He was wearing the cashmere coat I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years before. He paced up and down the sidewalk and I could tell, even from across the street, that he was the one talking, not listening. He stopped a couple of times and ran his hand through his hair the way he did when he was a boy and he'd broken something. My phone rang. It was him. I almost didn't pick up. I almost let it go. Dad, he said when I answered. Dad, what is this thing on our door? What thing? This eviction notice. It says we have 3 days. Dad, what the hell is going on? Did the property management company screw up or something? You need to call them. You need to call them right now. I let him hear me breathing. I let him hear the truck engine ticking as it cooled. I said, there's no property management company, son. He laughed, a short, confused laugh. What are you talking about? I said, I own the building. The line went quiet. I said, I have owned that building for 19 years. I bought it in 2005 when the previous owner went bankrupt, and I picked it up at auction. Your mother and I almost lived in the penthouse ourselves for a while, but she didn't want to leave the house. So I rented it out for 15 years. Then you came to me and asked if you could move in and pay rent, and I said yes. And you have not paid me a single dollar of that rent in 2 years, and I have been covering it out of my own pocket, and the joke is on me, son. The joke has been on me for a long time. He said, Dad, wait. I said, I asked you when the wedding was. I asked you a month ago. You looked me in the eye and you told me you hadn't picked a date. He said, Dad, that was her, that was Cameron. She wanted to. I said, you're a grown man. You made a choice. You and your wife made the choice together. And now you can both deal with the consequences together, which is the closest thing to adulthood the two of you have ever experienced. He started to talk fast. He started to explain. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said his wife was stressed. He said the wedding had been a small, spontaneous thing. He said he'd been planning to tell me. I said, son, I want you to listen to me. The locks will be changed on Friday at noon. If you and your wife are not out of the apartment by Thursday at 11:59 p.m., you will be removed by the sheriff. Everything that belongs to you, you may take. Anything that belonged to your mother or to me, you may not. My lawyer will be in the lobby at noon Friday with an inventory. Don't make her wait. He said, Dad, please. I said, I love you. I have always loved you. I will always love you. But I am not going to be your wallet anymore. Goodbye, son. I hung up. I sat in the truck. My hands were shaking. I'm not going to pretend they weren't. I sat in that truck across from the building I'd bought when my son was 13 years old, the building I'd been planning for most of his life to leave to him when I died, and I cried. I cried like an old man cries, which is quiet and ugly and full of years. Then I started the engine and I drove home. The next 48 hours were a circus. My son called 11 times. My daughter-in-law called 9. They left voicemails. They sent texts. The texts went from begging to apologizing to threatening to begging again in a span of about 6 hours. My daughter-in-law's mother called me from Annapolis and tried to play peacemaker. I was polite to her. I told her I had nothing against her or her family, but that my son and her daughter had made their bed, and I was no longer in the business of laundering the sheets. She got quiet and said she understood. She actually said, "Frankly, I've been worried about her for a while." That surprised me. We talked for almost an hour. She said her daughter had been raised right, but had been changing since college. She said she hadn't been invited to half the planning conversations for the wedding either. She said the wedding had been a private affair of about 200 people, most of whom were my daughter-in-law's social media contacts. I asked her if she had paid for the wedding. She laughed, tired, sad laugh. "No," she said. "Cameron told us it was being covered. She told us lunch your son's family was handling the venue and the catering." I sat down on my porch step. I said, "Ma'am, I want you to know I didn't pay a single dollar for that wedding. I wasn't invited. I didn't know it had happened until I walked in on the brunch reception by accident." There was a very long pause on her end. Then she said, "Oh my God. We agreed to talk again. I think she's going to be useful to me. Not in a scheming way, in a we are both the parents of fools way." On Thursday at 4 p.m., my son and my daughter-in-law moved out of the penthouse. They hired a moving company. I watched it happen from a coffee shop across the street, sipping a cup of black coffee, because I am 63 years old and I have earned the right to watch. My daughter-in-law came out first. She was wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast. She was on the phone the entire time. She did not lift a single box. My son carried most of them himself, with one mover, in the rain that started up around 5. He looked old. He looked like a man who just realized something about himself that he couldn't unrealize. At 7 that evening, I got a text from my son. It said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. On Friday at noon, my lawyer met me in the lobby. We went up together. The apartment was empty except for the things they had not been allowed to take. The dining table that had been my mother's, the credenza in the hall that I'd built in my own workshop, the wedding china that had been my wife's. There was a half-empty bottle of champagne on the kitchen island. There was a single white flower on the floor, crushed. My lawyer walked through with her clipboard. She made notes. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I will be." She said, "What are you going to do with it now?" I said, "I'm going to sell it." She raised an eyebrow. I said, "I'm going to sell the whole building. I don't want to be the landlord of the place where my son betrayed me. I'm going to take the proceeds and I'm going to put them in a trust for my brother's 2 grandkids who actually call me on my birthday." She nodded slowly. She said, "That's a hell of a thing." I said, "Yeah, well, so was the wedding I wasn't invited to." The building sold in 11 days. A developer out of Cleveland paid me cash for the entire property because he wanted the corner lot for a mixed-use project he was already planning down the block. The number doesn't matter. The number was enough. It was always going to be enough. I called my brother the night the wire hit. I told him what I'd done. He cried. He told me his grandkids would never forget this. I told him I knew. My son tried to reach out a few times after the move. He left long voicemails. He said he was working as an assistant manager at a sporting goods store, which was the first job he'd held in 9 months. He said his wife had moved back in with her parents in Annapolis and they were taking some time. He said he'd been seeing a therapist. He said he understood now what I had been trying to tell him for years. He asked if we could have coffee. I waited a month. Then I called him back. We met at a diner halfway between us. He looked thin. He looked tired. He looked like a person and not a costume. For the first time since college, maybe. I let him talk. I let him say everything he needed to say. I didn't interrupt. I didn't soften it. When he was done, I told him I loved him. I told him I forgave him. I told him that forgiveness was not the same thing as restoration and that we were going to rebuild a relationship from scratch, slowly, on a foundation of him being a man and not a son who needed things. I told him I would not be paying for anything else in his life. Not his rent, not his car, not his dental work, not his next wedding, if there ever was one. He said he understood. He said he didn't expect any of it. I told him I was proud of him for taking the job at the sporting goods store. He laughed and said it was the worst job he'd ever had, and also the only one that had ever felt real. I told him that was the most adult sentence he'd ever spoken in my presence. We finished our coffee. He paid the check. That was important to me. He paid the check. In the parking lot, before I got in my truck, he hugged me. He hadn't hugged me in maybe 10 years. He held on for a long time. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry. About Mom's china. About the wedding. About all of it." I said, "I know, son." I drove home. The sun was setting over the Allegheny. I could see the old steel bridge in the distance. I could see on the horizon the corner of Galway Avenue where my building used to be, the one with the penthouse where I had finally learned that respect is a thing you teach by example, or you do not teach at all. I will tell you the hardest part of the whole story, the part that nobody asks about. The hardest part wasn't the eviction. The hardest part wasn't the wedding I missed. The hardest part was looking in the mirror the morning after my daughter-in-law called me at 6:40 and admitting that I had built the monster myself. I had handed him every dollar. I had said yes to every ask. I had confused love with provision for 32 years, and the bill had finally come due, and the bill had my own signature on it. My wife would have called me a fool. She would have been right. But she would also, I think, have been proud of me for what I did next. Because the bill came due, and I paid it. Not in dollars, in something harder than dollars. I paid it in a single word. No. I'm sitting on my porch tonight with a cup of black coffee gone cold, watching the light fade out behind the maples, and I am thinking about the kind of man I used to be before the morning my daughter-in-law called me at 6:40. The truth I had to swallow, the one that nearly choked me, is that nobody did this to me. I did it to myself. Every check I wrote my son from the time he was 18. Every ask I said yes to when my gut was screaming. No, every time I told myself I was being a good father by smoothing the road in front of him. I was the one laying the bricks of the trap I eventually walked into. Cameron didn't make my son who he was. My son didn't make himself who he was. Not really. I made him. Slowly, kindly, with the best intentions in the world, I built a 32-year-old boy who could not pay his own rent, and a daughter-in-law who looked at me in my work jacket and decided I wasn't worth a seat at the wedding. Cause and effect. That is the whole of it. You cannot pour easy money into a young man's hands his entire life, and then be surprised when he doesn't know how to hold a hammer or a job or his own dignity. You cannot say yes to everything and expect the word no to mean anything when you finally use it. I think about the 3 things I believe a parent owes a child, now that I am too old to pretend I have all the answers. The first is character. You teach a child to do the right thing when no one is watching, and you do that by being the kind of person who does the right thing when no one is watching. I did not teach my son this. I taught him that money fixes character problems. It does not. The second is the mind. You teach a child to think, to weigh, to ask questions, to recognize when somebody, including their own father, is doing them no favors. I did not teach my son this either. I gave him answers when I should have given him questions. The third is grit. The bone-deep, hard-collused, get-back-up-and-go-again kind of grit that built every honest life I have ever admired, including for a long time, my own. I had it. I did not pass it on. Because every time my boy fell down, I picked him up before he could learn to use his own legs. If you are watching this, and you have a child or a grandchild or a brother, or anyone you love who is becoming the kind of person you don't recognize, I am telling you, with the full weight of my 63 years, that the kindest thing you can ever do for them is let them feel the shape of their own choices. The world will not love them the way you love them. Better they learn that from a small fall in your house than from a long one out in the cold. I started saying no on a Tuesday morning at 6:40. I should have started 40 years ago. But late is better than never, and the bill, once paid, stays paid.